It's Monday night, and after a long day of work, you get home, you go to the gym, work out a bit, and you come back upstairs and you make yourself dinner. After dinner, you decide that even though it's Monday, you had a hard day, so it's time to relax a little bit. So you put in a horror movie. You turn off all the lights in your house and you sit there and in the dark watching the movie. And during every jump scare in the movie, it just sends you screaming into a fit of anxiety and fear. But what actually is fear? Well, let's talk about that on today's episode of The Science Behind That.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, everybody, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That podcast. I hope you guys are doing good today. I know I'm doing great. It is a beautiful day here where I live. Bright and sunny, warm. We got a ton of rain for the past 2 days, so everything's green and it's really nice, and I hope it's equally as nice wherever in the world you guys may be. So, the other day I was scrolling through the podcast and looking at the episodes we've done, and it occurred to me that I've never done an episode on the thing that everybody experiences multiple times during their life, and that thing is fear. Everybody will experience fear, and you know, I feel like I should do an episode, or I felt like I should do an episode about what fear actually is and why we experience it. And the why we experience it will probably be the easiest part to answer. But before we start that, I want to try a little experiment with all of you. And for this experiment, you're going to either need to wear headphones or earbuds, or if you're in your car, you're going to want to crank up the volume in your car so the sound of my voice kind of surrounds you, kind of, fills your mind. And I'm going to play a brief little audio clip here, and all you guys have to do is listen to the audio clip. And afterwards, if you get any interesting feelings after listening to the audio clip, you can always send me an email at thesciencebt@gmail.com. I love reading your guys' emails and hearing what you guys have to say, and the questions you guys are running around in your minds, so that's great. So without further ado, let's start this little experiment. I'm going to stop here, drink some coffee, and I'm going to play this clip for you. Now, I know that was hard for you guys to hear, and some of you may not have been able to hear it at all. And in that instance, for those of you who are not able to hear it, don't worry. That just means you have normal human hearing. For those of you that were able to hear it, congratulations. That means you have above average human hearing. This sound frequency is particularly interesting to me. It is called the fear frequency, and it is a frequency of 19 hertz, which is 1 hertz below the threshold of human hearing. And I'm using air quotes for that because everybody has slightly different ranges of human hearing. The average human hearing range is 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. But some people are able to hear frequencies that are lower than that, and some people are able to hear frequencies that are higher than that. I myself, I've tested. I can comfortably hear frequencies down to around 17 hertz. And so, there may be people out there who can hear down to 16 or 15. But the point of this was not to test your hearing. The point of this is 19 hertz is often regarded by many as the fear frequency, because when you listen to this frequency, or when people listen to this frequency, they often report feelings of extreme anxiety, dizziness, headache, nausea, vomiting. Some people have even passed out. There was an entire Mythbusters episode on this frequency as well, if you guys are as into Mythbusters as I was when I was a kid. But there's a lot of interesting research that's just starting behind this frequency, and this is a field called infrasonics. So if you guys are interested in more of this, you can always just look up infrasonics, and this is an entire area of study. But this frequency is really interesting to me because in most people it's supposed to induce these feelings of anxiety and whatnot. And in some people it can even cause hallucinations. So some people believe that this frequency may be the reason for, or the cause behind, ghost sightings, is hearing this, is this infrasonic frequency somehow getting into wherever they are and causing hallucinations. And so this just got me thinking, like, what is fear? And fear is one of the essential emotions, one of the universal emotions in life. And it's a very complex emotion. In my opinion, it is one of the most complex emotions because unlike something like love, which simply boils down to oxytocin being released at the proper moment in your brain, fear is dependent on a lot more variables. So we'll try and break that down. So when you're scared by something, which we'll call the stimulus, you perceive that stimulus, so that either visual information or auditory information, iconic or echoic information, reaches the brain. It is processed, and if it is something that you should be afraid of, your amygdala activates, and your amygdala is primarily responsible for fear. And when this happens, you have a whole cocktail of neurotransmitters that are released in the brain, including cortisol, which is the principal stress hormone. And so this causes an endocrine cascade in your body of responses where these neurotransmitters act on their tropisms, or their target cell, which then results in the release of more of endocrine hormones, which induce the sympathetic nervous system response. And that sympathetic nervous system response it's contrary to the name sympathetic. So your heart rate massively increases, your salivary production decreases, your gastric function decreases, your urinary and urogenital function increases, and your muscular function increases. We also, when somebody is displaying the sympathetic nervous system response, we also see more glucose in the blood, because part of the response is to tell your muscles and organs, or to tell your organs that they need to release glucose in the blood to be used by your muscles. So, knowing this, then what actually dictates what somebody will be afraid of. And unfortunately, the answer to that isn't cut and dry. And I'll give you an example. So the frequency that I just played for you guys is called the fear frequency. I would love to hear what you guys thought of it. How did it affect you? Because when I listen to it, it relaxes me. And I don't think it's supposed to relax me. But when I listen to it, it relaxes me. And that just goes to show that everybody's different. Everybody's neurophysiology and neurochemistry is different, and therefore they will elicit different responses to these stimuli. So part of fear also involves habituation. So what I mean by this is this. I am applying to medical school with the dream of one day being a trauma surgeon. So because of that, blood and gore does not bother me. But I do know it bothers a lot of people. And so, I could watch a surgery with breakfast, and frequently I do. And that won't elicit any fear response in me. But if I show that same surgery to my best friend or my father or my sister, that may elicit a fear response in them. And that gets down to habituation. I've seen a lot of surgeries at this point that the act of seeing blood and viscera no longer elicits a fear response in me because I've essentially conditioned it not to, if that makes any sense. And that's called habituation. Habituation is a term that we often use in classical and operant conditioning where the specific conditioned response that we're looking for over time becomes extinct for whatever reason. And in this case, that conditioned response is going to be an evolutionarily conditioned response, which would be fear to blood. But if you see blood or gore enough times, that negative response will eventually become extinct or habituated. And so the question then becomes, are there any fears that are so ingrained in us that we cannot, become habituated to them? And personally, my opinion on that is no. Maybe the fear of death, but even then, not everybody is afraid of death. And so, personally speaking, I don't think that there is any fear or any stimulus that currently elicits a fear response in people that cannot be habituated away. So to summarize then what we've talked about, fear is as a result of your perception of the stimulus and your amygdala's perception of the stimulus, initiation of a nervous system response and the secretion of hormones, primarily cortisol, and then secretion of endocrine hormones, which stimulate the action of the sympathetic pathway. And then that's when that sympathetic pathway is activated, that's when we have the fight or flight response. And so oftentimes you'll hear people say that some people are fighters in the fight or flight response, other people are flighters. And that is not necessarily true. Our brains are pretty good at dictating the situations in which we would need to fight and we would in the situations in which we would need to run. So I think to an extent everybody has fight responses and flight responses. The thing that is unique among people is people's tendency to freeze or enter shock. That is unique to certain people. And what I mean by this is, if you've ever seen Night and Day, in the beginning of the movie, Tom Cruise is doing his thing. He's shooting all these people, And June in the movie she can't really move or talk. And so she turns to him and says, "Please stop shooting people." And Tom Cruise looks at him and says, "I understand you're in shock." That's shock. Shock comes as a result of many different things for different people, and it is a direct result of the sympathetic nervous system. So we often talk about fight or flight, but there's another one which is fight, flight, or shock. And shock is very, very common. A couple years ago, when when Syria was using chemical weapons against its people, there were a lot of people who had witnessed terrible things and they couldn't move or they couldn't speak. And we see that in all sorts of natural disasters, mass shootings, mass casualties, and ironically, even in attractions that come out around Halloween. So like haunted houses, there have been cases of people who get stuck in the middle of the haunted house because they can't move because they're in shock. So all of these things are a direct result of the action or of the perception of a stimulus. So because of this, I think fear then can be boiled down to your perception of the stimulus, of the fear, and the hormones that your body releases as a result of it. Because as I've already said, something that scares Susie won't scare Tommy, and something that scares Tommy, maybe Susie could become habituated to. And so fear is one of the more complex emotions, but at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to. And so now, before I bid you adieu for this Monday, let's quickly address the infrasonics, because we didn't really address that fully. The biggest question I could see you guys asking is, Atticus, why does 19 hertz elicit the fear response in me or in some people? And the answer to that isn't really well known. Some people believe that so there are in psychology, we have different thresholds, and they're called thresholds of perception. And it's basically a number or a percentage where a stimulus has to be at or exceed to be able to be perceived by the conscious mind. But that implies that it's being perceived by the subconscious mind, right? So there are a lot of people within the field of psychiatrics that believe that maybe the reason why infrasonics elicits various responses, because it's not just 19 hertz that elicits a response. There are all sorts of different frequencies, and you can look them up too. You can look up infrasonic frequencies and what they do. There are a ton of different frequencies. There's 18 hertz frequencies that does X, Y, or Z. Apparently 4 hertz is also supposed to elicit a fear response in people. So there are all sorts of these different frequencies that for some reason cause physiological responses in people, and we don't entirely know why. And as I was mentioning, some psychiatrists and some people in the psychiatric field believe that it may be because these frequencies are being perceived by the subconscious mind and are being interpreted as a threat, and at least the 19 hertz frequency, and is therefore causing the whole fear cascade, as I like to call it, that we talked about before. Some people think that it changes it modulates our brain waves. I don't know if I really believe that. That's kind of a weird theory. Personally, it's my opinion that when we perceive these tonal frequencies, when we perceive these tonal frequencies, for whatever reason, they're interpreted in odd ways. For me, again, 19 hertz was relaxing. I don't know why, but it was, and for other people, it's anxiety inducing. And so my guess is that the way it's being interpreted by the temporal lobe is different for every person, and it's based on life experiences maybe, and that changes what signals are processed and received. But ultimately, that is still an area of research that we don't really know a lot about. So for all of you young scientists out there listening to this podcast, I don't know, maybe infrasonics, if this really interests you, maybe infrasonics is a pathway for you to the deeper world of the human mind and psychology. So, ladies and gentlemen, as always, thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you have any questions or comments, always never be afraid to shoot me an email with those questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes. And again, also, if you have any fun responses to that little sound clip I played for you, you can also send me an email, and I may read some of them on Friday's episode. So thank you guys very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Have a beautiful week. It's again where I live right now. It is beautiful. I hope it is wherever you guys are. And as always, remember, guys, stand up and question everything.